Now let's talk about second Pepsis. Second Pepsis is also governed by the natural or vegetative faculty, and this time it occurs in the liver itself. The chyle received from the intestines is again acted upon through the instrumental faculties of attraction, retention, alteration, and expulsion, and turned into blood. Through attraction, the chyle is brought to the liver by way of the portal vein. There it is held by the faculty of retention. By way of the faculty of alteration, it is cooked, purified, and transformed, essentially concocted from chyle into blood. Blood in humoral medicine is the most complete and usable humor of the body. It provides nutrition to all parts of the body and carries the natural spirit. And again, I would argue that humoral blood is not the same as modern medicine's blood. In the process of the creation of blood, by heating, refining, and removing impurities, the other humors are created. The physical separation of impurities, which are actually humors, is based on the resultant humor's density. The lightest rises and the heaviest sinks. The other humors are a kind of impurity in relation to the refined blood, but they are a relative impurity that is still a necessary physiologic fluid. And so they're not an impurity in the sense of a pathology. After the concoction of blood, most of the blood is sent from the liver to nourish the organs and tissues, while a portion goes directly to the heart and is converted with pneuma into the vital spirit. The other humors are then also sent to their respective domains of the body. So let's look at the humors themselves. We have yellow bile, blood, phlegm, and black bile. The yellow bile is the lightest. It is the foam or scum that rises to the top. And if you've made broth or jam or cooked heavy stews, you know there's a foamy scum that floats to the surface that you skim off. And if you've ever decocted herbs, or if you've just made a cup of peppermint tea, you know the aromatics, the volatile oils, are floating on the surface. They hit your nose and your eyes, and you get a really strong organoleptic sensation even before you taste it. This volatile quality is the quality of yellow bile, the ability to warm, pierce, and mobilize. And being volatile, it is at the very top. Yellow bile helps to provide the heat of transformation to the stomach by making sure the stomach tissue is nice and warm, and it is thought to have a cleansing effect by driving impurities out of the body. From the liver, the majority is transported directly to the gallbladder, with only a tiny bit carried as an adjunct in the blood. The next level down is the blood. Blood is the most prevalent humor and the most important, with many vital functions. These are nourishment. Blood is the nutritive substance that feeds the organs. Growth and repair. Blood is used as a direct physical substrate. Blood carries the calor innatus, the innate heat or spark of life, through the body. Blood moistens the body. And the moistening here pertains specifically to the moisture internal to the organs and tissues. So it governs softness, flexibility, and suppleness. Phlegm also carries moisture, but the moisture of phlegm, by contrast, governs surfaces, cavities, membranes. So blood is organ moisture, phlegm is mucous membrane and joint and capsule moisture. Blood is also in charge of reproductive substances because reproductive substances are created from the blood. So this is obviously menstrual blood, but this is also mother's milk, which is transformed menstrual blood, and it's also semen, which is considered excess blood that is not lost in menses, therefore subsequently refined. Blood is the substrate for the spirits. The liver blood already contains the natural spirit. The heart kindles the vital spirit from that blood. The brain then refines the animal spirit from that vital spirit. So, the clarity and strength of all three spirits, spiritus or nomata, ultimately depend upon blood's quality. Blood also shows up in color and complexion, and as mentioned, blood carries the other humors to the organs and their respective repositories. Blood in the veins and arteries is again a kind of admixture. All of the other humors flow with the blood, which means that when the blood reaches a particular organ, the organ can siphon off the respective humor, because again, humors are not in solution. They're not dissolved in the blood. They coexist in a mixed state. In fact, humors dissolved in the blood is actually a kind of pathology. And just as blood carries humors to an organ or a tissue, it carries waste away to be excreted. The next dense is phlegm, which is just below the blood. Phlegm is a thick and cold substance. Now, the phlegm of humoral phlegm is not the phlegm we think of when we get a cold. It's just like with blood. Same name, different concept. What we call phlegm now is pathologic. Thick and excess secretions from the mucous membranes. Now, of course, I just said that phlegm is a thick substance, but it's not pathologically thick, like getting a cold. Humoral phlegm is on the thinner side, and it has a very important physiologic function. Being a little bit thinner, it moistens and spreads out. This is essential for the health of mucous membranes, as well as the synovial fluid of the joints. It is also linked to the serous fluid in body cavities and proper brain and nerve function, because the brain in humoral medicine needs to be cold. It's not healthy to be hot-headed. And think about it, whenever you have a fever, you're not thinking clearly. And with a high enough fever, there is loss of consciousness. Phlegm is the least concocted or changed of all of the humors. It is also generally seen to be the coldest humor, and you might wonder why. After all, phlegm is cold and wet, and when you hear about black bile, it's going to be described as cold and dry. Ice is colder than cold water. So, what makes phlegm, a liquid, colder than black bile, a solid? The reason is, when something is wet, there is energy transfer. Moisture shunts or transmits heat away. If it's 45 degrees out, you can get away with walking around in a t-shirt or a light sweatshirt. You see it all the time in the Midwest. But if your clothes are wet, you're freezing. That's why search and rescue has the saying, wet in 50 is more dangerous than dry in 30. The other thing that makes phlegm colder is that it moves. It's not frozen in a static state. So it's not localized like black bile is, but rather it spreads its coldness to other areas. And this means it takes heat away from other areas, whereas black bile stays put. The location of phlegm is, like blood, throughout the body. And phlegm does flow more with the blood than the other humors do. But phlegm does also have some locations it resides in, namely the joints, the lungs, the surfaces, the mucosal membranes, and the brain. Lastly, we have the heaviest humor, black bile, and this sinks to the bottom of the fluid matrix. Black bile, while still a humor and technically a fluid, acts very much like a solid. Black bile is carried in the veins with the blood to the spleen, specifically the splenic vein, where it is siphoned off and stored. It is linked to the material form of the body, particularly the harder structures like the bones, ligaments, and cartilage. Energetically, it has the effect of congealing and binding. Blood clots are probably central to this, which is why pathologies like masses are seen to be disorders of black bile. It is also essential for binding waste together for excretion, and this relates to bowel function. It firms the bowels so that they may pass. It also relates to holding the blood in the veins. We see pathologies of deficient black bile in easy bruising, menstrual spotting when it's not due to heat, and insofar as black bile is housed in the spleen and one of its functions is to hold the blood in the veins, this means that humoral spleen shares an interesting function with the Chinese spleen. Both govern the body's ability to hold blood in the vessels. But aside from that similarity, the organs are functionally entirely different. So why is black bile held by the spleen? Why not some other organ? In modern medicine, we know that, in addition to immune function, the spleen filters the blood and is a reservoir of blood. And this has bearing on dissections of the classical period. Because when an animal dies, is butchered, or is killed for the sake of dissections, blood flow stops and the blood pools. This, among other things, causes coagulation. And mass coagulation of blood occurs from 10 to 30 minutes after death. So, this means by the time a classical anatomist would have gotten to the spleen, what they would have found was not a living spleen filled with red blood, but a dead spleen filled with a large quantity of coagulated blood, which would have had a black, tarry appearance. And given the nature of blood to coagulate and the large amount of blood in the spleen, it's not hard to see how black bile would be seen to be housed there. It's also not hard to imagine that someone might look at blood's ability to coagulate seen in real time and see that as a kind of vital function that is so important that it can't be particular to the blood itself, but happening as a process throughout the body. We also have to recognize that people in the classical age didn't really know what the spleen was. And this wasn't just Greek humoral medicine. This was Ayurvedic and classical Chinese medicine as well. Ancient theorists from all medical systems plugged the spleen into existing theories in whatever way made most cohesive sense. Essentially, they identified meaningful correlative symptoms. In other words, certain symptoms always seem to cluster together, and they put these symptoms into correlative and causative categories, then assigned them to organ systems. Of course, this assignment wasn't arbitrary. There was some evidence to suggest the actual organ was involved. But it did mean that sometimes with organs like the spleen, things are a little abstract. This is why you can have an herbal system like Chinese herbalism that has very effective treatments for digestive complaints, even though it assigns in its classical theory a non-digestive organ, the spleen, a digestive function. And again, if you're not doing surgery and your main modality for treating internal medicine complaints is herbalism, anatomical accuracy is not really important. What's important is robust theory with internally consistent logic, which allows one to organize individual symptoms into larger symptom patterns, which have clear treatment strategies and herbal formulas, which then have reproducible positive results as defined by the metrics of the system itself and not some unrelated system imposed on it. And this is also why you can have an herbal system like Greek humoralism, which treats the spleen in an entirely different way, and yet is still valid, because it organizes individual symptoms into larger symptom patterns, which also have clear treatment strategies and herbal formulas, which have reproducible positive effects as defined by the metrics of the system itself. But getting back to the ancient Greeks, they actually did know that the spleen filtered the blood in some way. Ibn Sina, who was not Greek but inherited Greek humoralism and was a major figure in the Islamic Golden Age around 1000 CE, said explicitly that the spleen contained the residue of broken up blood. And the only way for broken up blood to get to the spleen is if the spleen is filtering it out. He further said the spleen removes black bile from the blood both for its own nourishment, but also to prevent the blood from being damaged. So again, filtering, removing damaged blood. So to sum up, we now have all of the humors created in second Pepsis. Blood is concocted in the liver from chyle. In the decoction process, the volatile portion, which is the yellow bile, ascends to be stored in the gallbladder. The black bile is carried to the spleen via the splenic vein, and what is meant to circulate widely in the body is the blood and the phlegm. And the blood and phlegm flow together but do not mix. There are trace amounts of yellow bile and black bile, but they should not be present and flowing admixed with the blood in any appreciable quantity. All of these humors provide all of the organs the motive force and ability to complete their various functions by determining their tissue states. And those various functions enabled by the powers of the humors is determined by the specific organs themselves. This is all governed by the natural faculty, otherwise known as the vegetative faculty. Now, let's compare second Pepsis with modern medicine. We already talked about the blood being different. The gallbladder stores bile, but not yellow bile. And the function of bile in the gallbladder, emulsifying fats, is different than yellow bile, which is an acrid heating substance. About the humors themselves. Again, modern medicine says there are no physical humors, because there aren't. And again, does that mean they aren't real and useful as part of guiding theory? That really depends upon what one's modalities are and whether one is more comfortable with the abstract or the literal. I think their justification for bloodletting is pretty hard to get behind, but I've also never seen it done. But I definitely do think they have value as a descriptor within a classical pharmacological model. But also, we shouldn't be so black and white. We should be more flexible in our thinking and use both. Both capture some aspect of reality. But that's just my soapbox. And of course, there is quite a bit more we could dissect and parse out about things that aren't quite right, but those are the broad strokes, and we'll be here all day if we keep going.